What if your entire life, your memories, your fears, your laughter, your name, were never truly yours? What if you were just a character, stitched together by words, thoughts, and meanings you never authored? This isn't science fiction. It's a theory emerging from the crossroads of cognitive science, philosophy, and language studies. The idea that you are nothing more than a story being told, a narrative self, a protagonist inside a plot with no true narrator. Every moment you believe you're choosing might just be the next sentence in a tale already unfolding. Your childhood traumas, backstory, your dreams, character motivation, that strange moment of déjà vu, a plot twist you weren't meant to catch. So sit back, let your body disappear into the mattress, and allow your consciousness to unravel like pages turning themselves. Because tonight, we're going to read the story of you, until the idea of you falls apart completely. You wake up every day and call yourself you. But who is that? A body? A mind? A collection of thoughts wrapped in skin? Or is it a story? A continuous, ever-telling story, where you is just the main character being narrated into existence? Cognitive science increasingly suggests that the self, the you feel so intimately, isn't a solid, enduring thing. It's a narrative, a fragile, ever-updating story your brain tells itself to make sense of the chaos. Imagine a book that writes itself every time you blink. Each thought, each emotion, every memory, is a sentence scribbled into this personal manuscript. You believe you're the author, but evidence hints you're just the protagonist. The real writing happens behind the scenes, subconsciously, automatically, without permission. In one of the most startling studies in cognitive neuroscience, patients with damaged brain regions began inventing elaborate stories to explain things they couldn't remember. A man who lost half his brain told doctors he'd just come from work, though he hadn't worked in years. Another insisted she was at home, though her hospital bed said otherwise. These weren't lies. They were stories. Stories the brain constructed in real time to protect the illusion of continuity. You see, your mind hates blank space. It fills in the gaps. It creates motivations for actions you didn't consciously choose, and then it convinces you that it was your idea all along. Psychologist Dan McAdams coined the term narrative identity to describe this phenomenon. According to his research, we organize our lives like novels, with chapters, themes, conflicts, and resolutions. We rewrite the past to fit the present. We cherry-pick what memories support our current image of self and discard the rest. It's not deception, it's survival. Without a story, the mind unravels. With a story, even if it's fiction, we feel real. But the unsettling part is this. If the self is a story, then it can be edited. And if it can be edited, who holds the pen? There's a reason you can't remember your earliest years. There's a reason your memories shift, your personality evolves, your opinions mutate. The story of you is a living document, revised, redacted, sometimes completely rewritten. When you look back on your life, the narrative changes, depending on your current mood, belief system, or even the questions someone asks you. And just like a story, your identity needs conflict. Think of how often you define yourself by what you've overcome. Heartbreak, failure, trauma. These aren't just events, they're plot devices. You've been taught to turn your pain into character development, and so the story tightens its grip. You've probably heard the phrase, "I'm working on myself." But what does that mean if you're a story? It means you're editing, choosing which chapters to highlight, which sentences to delete, which metaphors to keep. You're not just living, you're narrating yourself into existence. Here's the paradox. You can't step outside the story to see the whole thing, because the you trying to look is part of the story too. It's like a character in a novel trying to read the book they're in. Now picture this, you're at a party, and someone asks, "So, what do?" You don't answer with pure data. You answer with a story. "Well, I grew up here, went through that, now I'm doing this because of that." You tell them your character arc. Even small talk is a narrative performance. And yet, for all this storytelling, the true narrator remains silent, hidden. You don't know where the voice in your head comes from. You didn't choose your language, your childhood, your emotional wiring. You inherited a plot and spent your life pretending you wrote it. If you ever sit still long enough, without distractions, and listen to the thoughts rolling in your head, you'll hear it. The inner monologue, the omnipresent narrator. It describes your day, it judges your choices. It imagines the future, but it never shuts up. And most importantly, you don't control it. You hear it, but you don't write it. It writes you. So, Who are you, really? Are you the story being told? Are you the character playing it out? Or are you just the echo of a sentence that's still being written? That's the riddle of the narrative self, and the deeper we go, the more the chapters begin to fall apart. Let's start with something you think you know, your memories. You believe them to be true, solid, reliable. They're the bricks in the wall of your identity. The reason you are who you are, right? But what if those bricks are made of sand? What if memory isn't a recording, but a story you've been telling yourself, edited every time you remember it? Neuroscientist Elizabeth Loftus famously demonstrated this unsettling truth. In her research, she implanted false memories in participants by simply suggesting them. People began to recall events that had never happened, getting lost in a mall, being attacked by a dog, or even witnessing a crime. Not only did they remember these things, they could describe them in vivid detail. They had unknowingly written new chapters into their autobiographies, and believed them with absolute certainty. Memory, it turns out, is less like a photograph, and more like a Google Doc, constantly open for editing. Each time you recall something, you don't just access it, you rewrite it. You change the tone, the sequence, the emotion, and that new version, it overwrites the old one. Your brain doesn't keep the original, just the latest draft. It gets stranger. The hippocampus, the region of the brain responsible for forming new memories, is also active when you imagine the future. Why? Because memory isn't really about the past, it's about creating a consistent story, and if that story needs to project into tomorrow, it will use the same tools it uses to construct yesterday. You remember not to preserve truth, but to preserve the illusion of continuity. If your past changes, so does your identity, so your brain rewrites it, gently, seamlessly, invisibly. Ever notice how your childhood memories shift over time? A moment that once made you laugh might now sting, or a betrayal you swore you'd never forget begins to blur. That's your internal editor at work, redrafting your personal mythology to match your current character arc. Psychologists call this memory reconsolidation. You think you're remembering an event, but you're actually constructing it anew, like a dream you keep having, each time slightly different, each time more aligned with your current self-image. Now consider the implications. If memory is a fiction, what is guilt? What is regret? What are your core memories built on? Suppose you've spent years haunted by something you believe you did, something you're sure hurt someone. But what if the way you remember it is more dramatic than how it actually happened? What if your memory added flair, tension, exaggeration, like a novel trying to sell more copies? On the flip side, imagine memories you've buried, painful ones that don't fit the plot of the person you want to be. They don't vanish. They just get edited out of the active narrative. Your story doesn't stop. It just skips a few pages. This is why when two people recall the same event, they often disagree. Not because one is lying, but because each is telling their version of the story. Each brain has rewritten the event to match the emotional truth of their personal narrative. And this isn't sit to flaw. It sips a feature. If your brain gave you a raw, unedited replay of every experience, your sense of self would collapse under the contradictions. You'd be left with fragments, no cohesive plot, no sense of me. So your mind becomes a fiction factory, spinning memory into meaning. This is especially clear in traumatic experiences. Studies show that trauma is often remembered in non-linear, jumbled or disjointed ways. The brain tries to make sense of chaos by forcing it into a narrative framework, sometimes inventing motivations or justifications where none existed. It isn't deceit, it's survival through storytelling. Your nostalgia is a polished fable. Your heartbreak is a stylized tragedy. Even your triumphs are inflated like victory speeches. And every time you tell someone about your past, the story solidifies just a little more, even if it's not entirely true. Think of that friend who always tells the same story at parties. You've heard it 100 times, and it changes slightly each time. Why? Because the story isn't the memory. The story is the memory, and with each telling, it morphs, molding the teller as much as the listener. So here's the quiet terror. If your memories are fiction, then who are you? A storyteller with a faulty manuscript, or a story with no stable author? You say, I remember who I am, but really, you remember who you've become, and who you've become depends on which memories survived the edits. The next time a familiar image flashes in your mind, a school hallway, a childhood bedroom, a first kiss, pause and ask, am I remembering, Or am I narrating? Because in this theory, you don't recall the past. You rewrite it, and in doing so, you rewrite yourself. You think in language, you dream in it. You explain your world, your pain, your love, your identity using words. But have you ever stopped to wonder, did you create language, or did language create you? The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once said, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." What he meant was that you can only think about what you have words for. If your language doesn't contain a word for a feeling, you can't fully feel it. If it lacks a word for a thought, you struggle to think it. Language is not just how you express your reality, it's how you perceive it. Imagine you're a character in a novel. You don't exist outside the words that describe you. Your hopes, fears, quirks, and choices are confined to the sentences you're written into. The idea that you're real beyond the page is meaningless, unless language says so. And if the narrator stops writing, you vanish. Now, take a closer look at yourself. Your internal monologue is constructed with language. Your self-reflection is a dialogue, often silent, but always word-based. You tell yourself who you are, in phrases, idioms, and metaphors. I'm not good enough. I've always been this way. I can change. These aren't raw truths. They're linguistic constructs. Sentences dressed up as identity. In one powerful study, infants were shown to experience emotion and sensation long before they acquired language. But once they began learning words, something changed. They began labeling feelings instead of just experiencing them. Sadness became sad. Pain became hurt. Love became I love you. Language carved the infinite fluidity of experience into boxes, and from then on, every emotion had a frame. And once you give something a name, you give it power. You define it, limit it, explain it, and in doing so, rewrite how you interact with it. Yourself is a linguistic artifact. You call yourself by a name. You describe yourself in adjectives: kind, stubborn, anxious, brave. But each of those words comes with connotations, cultural baggage, inherited meanings. You didn't invent these terms. They were handed to you like props in a play, and you've been performing them ever since. Language also locks you into certain narratives. For example, English is subject-verb-object. I did this. It frames you as an active agent, but in other languages, like Japanese or Hopi, agency is often removed or blurred. Instead of I broke the vase, it becomes the vase broke. And studies show that this shift in grammar changes how blame, responsibility, and even memory are formed. Which raises the question, if your native language were different, would your identity be different too? The answer seems to be yes. In bilingual individuals, personality often changes with language. Someone might be more assertive in English and more reserved in Korean. Not because the person changes, but because the linguistic context does. The story shifts depending on the language telling it. Now consider this when you journal, when you confess, when you describe yourself. You reach for metaphors. I'm carrying baggage. I'm stuck in a loop. I feel like a fraud. These are narrative devices. Language doesn't just reflect your inner world, it shapes it like a script. Even silence, ironically, is defined by language. We call it awkward silence, peaceful silence, heavy silence, always giving it context, always forcing it into narrative form. You can't escape the story. Even nothingness must be explained. In therapy, patients often find healing by changing the words they use. A trauma survivor might reframe their identity from I was broken to I was shaped. The event is the same. The story changes. And with that, the self begins to shift. This is why language is more than communication. It's construction. You weren't merely taught how to speak. You were taught how to exist. The poet Anne Carson once said, "Words are like nets. We hope they'll cover what we mean, but we know they won't." You think you're expressing the truth, but you're only ever offering a translation, a paraphrased version of something deeper, something unspeakable. But in the absence of raw feeling, you accept the edited version, you accept the words. And so, the story continues. Every day you narrate yourself. I step doing my best. I can handle this. I know who I am. But behind those sentences is something wordless. Something vast, and that's the part that language hides, even as it reveals. So here sits the paradox. Language gives you identity, but it also gives you the illusion of identity. You are not just the one speaking, you are being spoken. Because if you are nothing but a story, Then it sits to language holding the pen. You hear the voice, "Done set you." That running commentary in your head. The one narrating your day, interpreting your feelings, predicting conversations, analyzing glances. "She looked at me weird. I shouldn't have said that. I hope they like me." That voice doesn't rest. It talks even when you're quiet. It whispers when you try to sleep. It shouts when you want peace. But here's the unsettling question. Who's doing the talking? You assume it's you. Of course it's you. It sounds like your voice, uses your phrases, knows your secrets. But think about this. Have you ever consciously decided to think a thought? Did you craft it like a sentence in a novel? Or did it simply arrive, uninvited? Try this. Sit still and observe the next thought that appears in your mind. Watch it arrive. Notice how it wasn't summoned. You didn't plan it. It just showed up, like a line from a script you didn't write. This is the enigma of the narrator. That omnipresent voice that feels like you, but operates like something else. If you are the story, and the thoughts are the narration, then what is the narrator? Cognitive scientists have spent decades trying to locate it. They dissect the brain, study neural patterns, analyze consciousness, but nowhere have they found a central self calling the shots. There's no little person behind your eyes, no command center, no writer's room, just a cacophony of neurons firing in patterns that somehow produce the illusion of authorship. One of the most haunting experiments in neuroscience is the Libet experiment. Participants were asked to flex their wrists whenever they felt like it. They were also told to note the exact moment they decided to move. But here's the twist. Brain scans showed activity in the motor cortex before participants reported making the decision. The brain had already decided. The narrator showed up late and claimed it was in charge. This implies something almost unbelievable. The narrator may just be a voice invented after the fact, telling a story that justifies what the body and brain already did. You act, then narrate, not the other way around. And the narrator? It lies. It tells you you're in control, that you meant to do that this was all part of your plan, because a story without a narrator is chaos, and your mind would rather lie to you than admit it's improvising. Now think about moments when the narration breaks down. Panic attacks, intrusive thoughts, dissociation. The voice becomes a stranger. It says things you'd never admit out loud. Sometimes it speaks in second person. You're a failure. You'll mess this up. Who's speaking then? And in psychosis or schizophrenia, the voice becomes external. Some people hear it as God, others as demons. But in every case, the narrator detaches from the character. The story fractures, and identity unravels. Even in dreams, the narrator shifts. You experience the dream as you, yet often recognize it's unreal. Who's aware of the dream? Who inserts logic into that chaos? A hidden narrator, editing scenes on the fly. In storytelling, a narrator can be reliable or unreliable. But what about yours? If your inner voice edits memories, justifies impulses, and retroactively claims decisions it didn't make, can you trust it? Or are you just following a voice that's improvising a plot to keep you sane? Here's the true paradox. The narrator feels like the core of you, but if you inspect it closely, it disappears. Try to pin it down and it evaporates, like trying to find the page where the book starts narrating itself. In Eastern philosophies, particularly in Zen and Advaita Vedanta, they speak of this illusion. The ego is the voice, they say, not the self. The true self is the silent witness, the space behind the voice, not the narrator, but the awareness that hears the narration. But the Western mind isn't trained to hear silence. It clings to story, to voice, to identity. So when you ask, who's the narrator? Your mind scrambles. It wants an answer, a face, a name. But there isn't instead one. Just a voice. Floating in the margins, telling the story of you, pretending it knows how it ends. So maybe you stir not the narrator. Maybe you stir not even the story. Maybe you stir the silence beneath it all, wondering who wrote the next line. You love a good story. Everyone does. Stories have structure, they have arcs. They begin somewhere, they build tension, they reach a climax, and hopefully they resolve. That's what makes them satisfying, meaningful, complete. And so, naturally you expect your life to follow the same logic. You expect a plot. But what if that's the greatest illusion of all? You look at your life, and try to make sense of it, like a novel. You interpret your childhood as Act 1. You call your traumas turning points. You believe your choices build toward a purpose, and you search for that one big climax that will make everything make sense. The job, the lover, the realization. But this isn't a story, it's chaos dressed as structure. And the plot, that's the trick your mind plays to make you believe there's order. This tendency is known in psychology as narrative bias, the mind's compulsion to impose coherence onto randomness. If a coin lands on heads 5 times, you expect tails next because a plot must balance out. If your year begins badly, you call it foreshadowing. If you overcome hardship, you label it character growth. But these are literary devices, not laws of nature. Consider this. If someone asks you how you became who you are, you'll tell them a story. But that story changes depending on who's listening, what you're feeling, what day it is. The facts stay the same, but the plot twists vary. Because deep down you know the truth. There is no one fixed version. There is only the story you're telling right now. Studies in cognitive psychology show that people retroactively assign meaning to events once they know the outcome. If a relationship ended badly, you reinterpret the early moments as signs. If it ended well, you call them destiny. In both cases, the story is edited backwards to fit the ending. This is teleological thinking, the assumption that everything happened for a reason, that your life has a plot, that your suffering had purpose, that your joy was earned. But the brain doesn't tell stories to reveal truth. It tells stories to feel safe. Why did this happen to me? What was it all for? What comes next? These are questions a story can answer. And so your mind obliges, fabricating foreshadowing, inventing symbolic meaning, casting you as the resilient hero, the tragic figure, the rising phoenix. But what if your life has no arc? What if there's no climax? No resolution? Would you still feel real? Here's the problem. Stories have direction. They point forward. You always think the next chapter will reveal the reason for the last one. But when that chapter disappoints, when life just continues, you feel disoriented, as if the story betrayed you, but it didn't. It was never real to begin with. Now think about how stories handle time. They compress it. A lifetime in 300 pages. A war in 2 hours. A breakup in a montage. Your mind copies this trick. It skips through years with a sentence. That's when everything changed. Those were the hard years. Then I found peace. But the truth is, those years were endless. Boring, messy, full of contradictions. You've trimmed them down to fit the story. And yet, we judge ourselves by the logic of stories. We think if we haven't accomplished something by a certain age, we've failed our plot. We crave redemption arcs. We fear becoming side characters. We envy the illusion of closure others seem to have. But life isn't structured like a novel. It's more like a glitchy, infinite scroll, interrupted by random ads and broken hyperlinks. And still, you try to find the storyline in the static. Even death is framed as a final chapter, a clean ending. But life doesn't end in punctuation. It just stops, sometimes mid-sentence. In film, this illusion is known as the cut. The character walks away and the screen fades to black. The audience assumes the story ends there, but in reality, the character might have tripped, gotten lost, changed their mind. You too live in the cut. You narrate your life as if it follows structure. But the moment the scene fades, the truth veers off script. This doesn't mean your life is meaningless. It means meaning is a product of storytelling. You create it, you assign it, you mold it, like clay around raw experience. And sometimes that clay looks like a novel. Other times, it looks like nonsense. So ask yourself, is your pain part of a redemption arc, or is that just what you need to believe to keep going? Are you moving toward a climax, or just narrating one into existence? The illusion of plot is comforting, but it's still an illusion. Maybe you stir not in a story. Maybe you stir in a sentence that never ends. Tick, tick. You think of time as linear, past, present, future, clean and tidy, a road stretching behind and before you. That's the narrative you've been taught. But what if that's just a story structure your brain imposes on chaos? What if time isn't a road, but a paragraph, edited, reordered, and rearranged to make the plot make sense? You don't experience time directly. You experience moments, flashes. Then your mind strings those flashes together and calls it a timeline. But it's more like a timeline you can't trust. Your brain is the unreliable narrator of your past and an overconfident screenwriter of your future. Neuroscience shows that your perception of time is elastic. In trauma, time slows down. In boredom, it drags. In joy, it vanishes. In danger, it warps. So how can something so subjective be used to define the truth of your life story? You say, that happened years ago, but what you really mean is my brain stores that moment far away from now, and even that distance is flexible. A memory can feel ancient one day and fresh the next. A future plan can feel urgent, then suddenly unreal. Time doesn't unfold evenly. It jumps, loops, folds in on itself, but the narrative you live by needs it to be linear, because a story needs progress, and progress needs time, so your brain fakes it. Think of how a novel works. It has a beginning, middle, and end. The plot unfolds across pages. Time flows, but the author can also play with it. Flashbacks, foreshadowing, non-linear timelines. Still, the reader interprets it as a story moving through time. That's what you do with your life. You tell yourself, I used to be that person, but I sip and different now. You believe in growth, in phases, in before and after. You turn time into metaphor, turning a corner, closing a chapter, reaching a breaking point. But those are all just phrases. Linguistic scaffolding to give your life shape. Time, in this narrative, becomes the spine of the story. Without it, everything collapses into a formless now. Consider this. Your brain doesn't store memories like a video recorder. It stores them like a scrapbook. Not in sequence, but in emotion. Not in facts, but in fragments. That's why a smell or a song can pull you back decades in an instant. That's why you sometimes feel 8 years old again, or why an old regret suddenly burns like it just happened. So when you say, I'm older now, ask, do you mean your body or your character arc? Philosophers like Augustine and Heidegger struggled to define time. They found it elusive. Augustine famously said, what is time? If no one asks me, I know what it is. If I try to explain it, I don't, because the moment you try to grasp it, it slips. Like language, time breaks apart under scrutiny. Quantum physics doesn't help. In some interpretations, past and future coexist. The arrow of time is not fundamental. It's an illusion that arises from how we experience entropy. In simpler terms, things feel like they're moving forward, because that's the only direction your story allows. Now think about dreams. In a dream, you can live an entire lifetime in 30 seconds. You can flip through past, present, and future without blinking. There's no clock, no order, just scenes, emotions, story fragments. And yet it feels real. You don't question the time structure until you wake up. So how do you know you sound not dreaming now? Your brain needs to believe it sips moving through time. It needs that illusion to create character development, to track cause and effect, to have guilt or hope or nostalgia. You need a before. To change, you need a next. But what if there is no before, no next? What if everything you are is just happening at once right now, and your mind is telling you it's unfolding? In meditation or psychedelic states, time can disappear. People describe feeling outside time, floating in an eternal now. The narrator shuts up. The story halts, and suddenly, without a timeline, identity dissolves. That sip's not poetic. It sips neurological. Time is a structure imposed on consciousness, not a feature of it. Your brain imposes order on unordered experience, and calls it time. It's the narrative backbone your self hangs on. But time lies. It tells you, you've come so far. It tells you, you're running out. It tells you, everything will make sense in the end. And you listen, because without time, how would the story unfold? You aren't set, just living through time. You stir being written across it. And maybe that ticking you hear isn't sipped a clock. Maybe it sips the sound of pages turning, one sentence at a time. Every story has a writer, or so we believe. Someone had to plan the arc. Someone had to decide where the story begins and how it ends. Someone had to shape the characters, drop the clues, create the voice. So when you look at your own life, this strange narrative full of coincidences, patterns, heartbreaks, and tiny moments that feel oddly symbolic, you can't help but wonder who's writing this. Most people grow up believing it's them. I am the author of my life, they say. I choose my path. That's the myth of free will, essential to the narrative. Without it, the plot feels mechanical, pointless, cruel. But the deeper you look, the harder it is to find the author. If you are the writer, why didn't you choose your childhood, your culture, your body, your mind? You didn't select your brain chemistry or your emotional wiring. You inherited those. You were dropped into a draft already in progress. Okay, maybe you're the co-author then. Maybe you start writing once you become conscious. But here's the problem. Your consciousness is late to the party. Your brain makes decisions milliseconds before you become aware of them. By the time the narrator says, "I've decided," the decision's already happened. The ink was already on the page. In neuroscience, this is called post hoc rationalization. You act, then invent a story explaining why. Your inner narrator weaves meaning into the moment, after the fact. It's not deception, it's design. You are not the author, you are the publicist. Then, who is the real author? Some say biology, genes, evolution. Your brain's task is survival, not truth. It writes stories to keep the organism functioning, not necessarily to reflect reality. That version of you who believes they're making deep, personal decisions, a very convincing character. Others say culture writes you, that your self is a collage of language, expectations, archetypes. You play roles handed to you by society, student, partner, rebel, healer, and then convince yourself you chose them. And some take it even further. Philosopher Michel Foucault argued that the author is a modern invention. In ancient storytelling, authorship didn't matter. Stories were communal. Over time, the West began to obsess over the idea of the creator, the one behind the scenes pulling the strings. But what if the author was just another character, invented to comfort the reader? When you journal, you feel like the author. You choose the words. You express your feelings. But pause for a moment. Where did those feelings come from? Why did certain words feel right? Why did the sentence take that shape? Was it your hand guiding the pen, or something deeper, something automatic? Writers often say, the story wrote itself. Characters made choices, the author didn't plan. Plot twists emerged that weren't mapped. What if your life is like that? What if it's unfolding, moment to moment, and the illusion of authorship is just a trick the mind plays to give you a sense of control? Now consider dreams again. In dreams, your mind constructs entire worlds, characters, dialogue, even plot twists, and you experience it as a passive observer, sometimes an active participant, but never the author. You don't write your dreams, they write you. And yet, something is scripting them. So maybe the author isn't a person. Maybe it's a process, a machine, a language system looping on itself. Maybe the story of you is being written by algorithms of thought, habit, and biology, mechanical in origin, but poetic in effect. In Buddhism, the self is said to be not self. There is no unchanging core, no author behind the curtain, just patterns arising and passing, like wind moving through trees, like a story without a pen. It sounds terrifying, doesn't it? The idea that no one's in charge, that no one's writing this, that it's all just unfolding. But maybe that sips freedom. Maybe the author vanishes so that the story can write itself. Because here sets the paradox. If you were the true author of your life, you stood know what comes next. You stead never be surprised. And that would ruin the story. So you keep reading, page by page, line by line, wondering if the author will ever reveal themselves. But all you find is more story. Every story has more than one character, and every character in that same story walks away with a different version of what happened. You do this too, every day. You remember a moment one way, someone else remembers it, another. You're sure you were kind. They say you were cold. You remember laughter. They remember silence. Who's right? Both of you, and neither. Because in the theory that you exist only as a story being told, every other person in your life is also a character, and they're telling their own story. That means your role in their narrative may look nothing like the version you hold on to. To you, you're the protagonist. To them, maybe the antagonist, or a footnote, or a plot twist. You see your character arc unfolding with meaning and intention. They see something else entirely. This fragmentation isn't a glitch. It's the nature of narrative memory. Studies show that eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable. Two people can witness the same event, a car crash, an argument, a wedding, and walk away with conflicting memories. Not because anyone is lying, but because the brain doesn't record, it reconstructs. Each person's memory is shaped by emotion, attention, prior beliefs, and most importantly, their role in the story. The hero remembers triumph, the victim remembers injustice, the bystander remembers confusion. In psychology, this is called motivated recall. You remember events in ways that protect your identity. Your memory edits facts to keep your internal story intact. If someone criticizes you, your mind might delete the part where you were short-tempered earlier. Or if you succeed, you might remember more obstacles than there really were, to make the triumph feel earned. Now multiply this by every character in your life. Each friend, sibling, partner, co-worker, they all carry a different version of you inside them, a different character, a different backstory, a different interpretation of the same scenes. You're not one you, you're 1,000 you, scattered across the narratives of others, none of which match the version you're telling yourself. Sometimes you glimpse these versions through conflict, compliments, confusion. Someone says, "That's so unlike you," and you wonder, what do they think I am? Or someone says, "You've always been like this," and you bristle, because that's not how your story goes. But that's the cost of being a character. You don't control how you're written into other people's books. Even worse, they remember scenes you forgot, or interpret them in ways you never imagined. A joke you thought was harmless became a wound. A silence you thought was neutral became rejection. A glance you don't recall became obsession. In their narrative, that moment changed everything. In yours, it was barely a sentence. Now imagine all those stories overlapping. Your memory is fiction. Their memory is counterfiction. And somewhere in between, a third version that no one remembers clearly because it never really existed. This isn't just philosophical. It's biological. Neuroscience shows that the hippocampus, responsible for memory, stores and retrieves memories differently depending on context, emotional intensity, social role, and even cultural expectations all influence how memories are coded and recalled. The brain doesn't care about accuracy, it cares about coherence. So you could say that each character in your life is writing fan fiction about you, based on limited scenes, biased impressions and emotional tone, and you're doing the same to them. Everyone is living in a different draft of the same story. Here's where it gets weird. Sometimes you even play different roles within your own story. You remember yourself at age 16, and it feels like a different person. You cringe, you disown, you narrate from a distance. I was so naive, you say, as if that wasn't you. Because even within yourself, memory fragments. You become different characters over time, and each new you rewrites the past to fit the current plot. In trauma recovery, this is especially visible. Survivors often speak of a younger self they had to abandon, or a version of themselves that didn't survive. They speak about those fragments as if they were ghosts inside the story, unfinished, unacknowledged characters in a narrative that kept moving. Which raises a question. If memory is fiction, and everyone remembers differently, what happens to truth? Truth becomes a rumor, a whispered draft, an echo of a scene no one agrees on. But maybe that sip's okay. Maybe the beauty of your story isn't in its accuracy, but in its multiplicity. You are not a single narrative. You are a library of perspectives, a genre-hopping, plot-twisting, unreliable anthology, retold again and again through different eyes. And perhaps that's why it hurts so much to be misunderstood. Not because they don't see you, but because they're reading a different edition of your story and you can't control which version they got. You can only keep telling yours, and accept that every character will remember you differently. Because in a world made of stories, no two readers read the same line, the same way. If you could crack open your mind and look inside, what would you see? Thoughts, memories, desires, regrets, maybe a bit of panic, maybe a loop of that embarrassing thing you said 3 years ago, maybe your entire identity, swirling around like dialogue in a play you don't remember auditioning for. Now imagine this. Your mind is not a blank canvas. It's a script, a pre-written, continuously revised document filled with lines, scenes, and directions you believe you're improvising, but you're not. You're following the cues without realizing you're doing it. You think you're ad-libbing, but the structure was there long before you walked on stage. From the moment you were born, lines were handed to you. Good boy, smart girl, don't sit cry, be strong. These weren't just words. They were character development. Scripts written by parents, teachers, media, culture, Scripts that slowly taught you how to perform you. The way you react to criticism. Scripted. The way you laugh when you sit nervous. Scripted. Even the voice in your head that narrates your day. Scripted. Psychologists call this schema, mental frameworks that guide how we interpret and respond to the world. They shape how we think, what we expect, and how we explain events. You're not reacting to reality, you're reacting to the version of reality your script predicted. And just like a script, your mind has genres. Some people live in comedies. They deflect pain with laughter, even when their heart is breaking. Others live in tragedies, waiting for the next disaster to confirm the storyline. Some craft epic hero journeys. Others sink into noir. But the story isn't always chosen. It's often inherited. Think of your inner dialogue, the way you talk to yourself. I can't do this. They're going to leave. I don't belong here. These aren't thoughts, they're lines, memorized, rehearsed, delivered on cue, over and over, until you believe the performance. And what about those recurring thoughts? The loops? The intrusive lines that enter the script uninvited. I'm not good enough. It's going to fall apart. They'll see the real me. These lines weren't written by reason. They were written by fear, by repetition, by old scripts that should have been cut in rewrites. Now think about how the brain reacts when those scripts are challenged. Ever tried to believe something new about yourself? That you're worthy? That you're safe? That you're capable? Watch how the mind fights back. It clings to the old lines. It edits out the new ones. Because the brain prefers consistency over truth. It would rather keep a flawed script than admit the story could change. In therapy, this is one of the hardest battles, rewriting the inner script. It's not about adding new lines. It's about confronting the old ones. The ones whispered to you when you were too young to question them. The ones you absorbed from people who didn't know how to write you kindly. But your mind resists edits. It throws up defenses. This isn't me. I don't deserve this. It's too late. Not because those things are true, but because they feel familiar, and the brain loves familiarity. Familiar scripts feel safe, even when they hurt. Neurologically, this comes down to neural pathways. Repeated thoughts carve grooves in the brain, like paths in a forest. The more you walk them, the deeper they get. The deeper they get, the harder they are to leave. That's why it feels like your mind has a life of its own. Like it's following a script you didn't write, but can't seem to stop acting out. But here sits the good news. Scripts can be revised. New lines can be rehearsed. New scenes can be imagined. But it takes conscious effort and repetition. You don't just say I'm enough once and walk off stage. You say it 1,000 times, even when the old lines fight back. You rewrite again and again until the new version starts to feel real. And here's the twist. Even this process of rewriting is a narrative too. Another arc, another chapter, the plot of how I changed. And that's okay, because even if the mind is a script, you're not entirely trapped in the first draft. But you do need to ask who's holding the pen now. Is it the voice of your past? The expectations of others? The echo of a character you no longer are? Or can you step into the margins, cross out what no longer fits, and scribble something new? Because if the mind is a script, then every thought is a line. Every emotion, a scene. Every belief, a monologue. And maybe, just maybe, to rewrite your role, you wake up. The world feels solid. There's a bed, a ceiling, a sense of now. But behind that feeling of certainty is a strange truth. What you're experiencing isn't raw reality. It's a story your brain is telling using metaphors. Metaphors aren't just poetic tools. They're the scaffolding of perception. You don't just describe your life in metaphors. You understand it through them. I'm carrying a burden. Time is running out. She has a cold heart. These aren't facts. They're symbolic frames. And without them, reality wouldn't make sense to you. Your brain can't process the chaos of pure experience, so it converts it into symbolic structure. You don't feel stressed. You say, I'm under pressure. You don't feel lost. You say, I'm off track. Reality is turned into maps, forces, weather systems, just so you can hold it in your mind. But what if you've mistaken the metaphor for the thing itself? Take love. You say I fell for her, like love is gravity. You say we have chemistry, like it's a formula. You say they broke my heart, like it's an object. But none of these are literal. They're shortcuts, abstractions. Emotional stories pretending to be physical truths. You're not falling. There's no chemical formula. Your heart didn't crack like a vase. But without metaphor, you can't explain the feeling, so you narrate it. Even time, which feels so constant, is drenched in metaphor. You spend time, you waste it, you run out of it. These are ideas borrowed from money, not physics. In other cultures, time doesn't flow forward at all. In some Native American languages, the past is in front, visible, the future is behind, unknown. That's a completely different metaphorical structure, which means the direction you think you're walking through life. That's not universal. That's a story built from language. Now go deeper. You don't just use metaphors. You are one. Yourself is not a scientific object. It's a narrative symbol. You say, I'm finding myself, I lost myself, I'm becoming who I'm meant to be. But the self isn't lost. It didn't wander off. These are metaphors we cling to because they give our chaos a container. They shape confusion into plot. They let us pretend we're progressing towards something. In psychotherapy, a major breakthrough often comes when someone shifts metaphors. A survivor stops saying I'm broken and starts saying I'm healing. A grieving parent stops saying I'm drowning and starts saying I'm navigating grief. Same pain, new frame, and with that shift, the story changes. But here's the paradox. Metaphors give meaning, but they also trap it. If you say your life is a battle, you begin to see enemies everywhere. If you say it's a journey, you feel like you should be farther along. If you call your mind a machine, you fear breakdowns. If you call it a storm, you expect destruction. Every metaphor carries an entire worldview with it, and once adopted, it limits what else you can see. This is why so many spiritual practices emphasize silence, not because silence is holy, but because it suspends metaphor. It creates space before the story, a breath before the symbol, a chance to witness life not as narrative, but as presence. But your brain hates the void. It rushes to fill the silence with structure. This must mean something. This is happening for a reason. There's a lesson here. These are metaphorical impulses, not truths. You reach for metaphor like a character reaching for a lamp in the dark, hoping to illuminate the scene. But sometimes, there is no lamp, just dark. Even your sense of place is metaphorical. You live in a home, you go to work, you return, or escape. But space isn't inherently meaningful. It's neutral until the story assigns it emotion. That cafe where you fell in love, just a room. That corner where you lost someone, just a sidewalk. But in your narrative, they become symbols, landmarks in a metaphorical landscape. This is what it means to live inside a story being told. Not only is your memory fiction, not only is your identity narrative, but the very world around you, the real world, is shaped by metaphors you didn't invent but inherited. And maybe that's why it feels so hard to find meaning. Because you steer not searching for truth. You stir searching for the right metaphor, one that makes it all make sense. So, what story are you inside? And what metaphor are you using to survive it? Because if reality is a metaphor, then your life isn't a fact. It's a figure of speech, echoed through consciousness, and endlessly rewritten. Let's talk about your favorite illusion conversation. You think you're having one right now, with yourself, that inner monologue. It's just dialogue with a single voice. You think, you reflect, you argue, you ask questions, and then answer them. It feels like autonomy, like insight. But what if it's all scripted? Think about how most of your thoughts take the form of language. Not images, not raw feelings, but words. Internal sentences looping endlessly, and those words usually sound like someone you know. Your parents, a teacher, a lover, a bully, a stranger who once said something sharp. You're not thinking for yourself. You're repeating what you've heard. You're rehearsing old scenes with invisible characters. This is the dialogue trap, where your thoughts are not your own, but conversations you've been trained to have. Ever catch yourself playing out arguments in your head, rehearsing what you'd say to someone who hurt you, or defending yourself to someone who isn't there? These imagined dialogues aren't harmless. They're scripts. They shape how you see yourself. They become the voice of your identity. Psychologists call this internalized dialogue. We absorb the voices around us and make them our own. A critical parent becomes your inner critic. A supportive friend becomes your self-compassion. You simulate their words and integrate them into your thinking. and over time the original source disappears, but the dialogue remains. Now think about how you talk to yourself after failure. Whose voice is it? Is it kind, cruel, analytical, desperate? That tone, those words, that posture, are you sure it's you? Because in this theory, that you exist only as a story being told, dialogue is the mechanism of control. It gives the illusion of self-reflection, but often, it's just repetition, a loop of phrases you've heard, absorbed, and now weaponize against yourself. And external conversations follow the same script. Most talking is just people exchanging pre-written lines. How are you? I'm good, you. Busy lately? These aren't genuine questions, they're societal filler, dialogue used as background noise in the story of social survival. Even deeper conversations often unfold within predictable frameworks, comfort zones, familiar patterns, shared metaphors. True originality is rare. In theatre, there's a term called blocking, where actors move through pre-planned positions. Dialogue happens as if it's spontaneous, but every line, every gesture is rehearsed. You live this way too. You have blocking in arguments, in apologies, in interviews, even in love. When you text someone and wait for their reply, you're not just waiting, you're writing their line in your head, you're drafting their response, you're setting the tone of their role, and when they break script, say something unexpected, you feel disoriented, because the story isn't flowing right. The dialogue trap is not just about speaking, it's about expectation. It's the mind's addiction to back and forth structure. A question must have an answer. A comment must be met with reaction. Silence feels like a glitch in the script, so we fill it. We talk to avoid empty space in the narrative. And the deepest trap. You try to fix yourself using dialogue. You tell yourself things. You still okay. You can handle this. It's going to be fine. But sometimes those words don't land. Not because they're untrue, but because the script behind them is outdated. You're applying fresh dialogue to an old narrative. You're trying to rewrite a scene that's already been performed 1,000 times. Therapists often say, don't believe everything you think, but they could also say, don't believe every voice in the dialogue, because some of those voices are liars, some are echoes, some are ghosts. And even silence isn't set truly silent. It sits just paused dialogue, waiting for the next line. Here sits the paradox. Dialogue feels like connection. It feels like progress. But often, it sits just performance. Scripted identity pretending to be spontaneous expression. You think you're finding yourself through conversation, but you're just running scenes, over and over. So how do you break free? Maybe you don't sit. Maybe you stop trying to speak your truth, and start listening for the silence between the lines. Because in this story, the dialogue isn't set what defines you. It stops the space where the story forgets to talk. Let's start with the narrator you trust most, yourself. You speak in first person. I did this. I believe that. I'm feeling okay. It feels stable, familiar, intimate. You're inside the story, walking through its scenes. The I gives it weight, authority, ownership. But what if that I isn't reliable? What if the voice in your head, the one telling the story of you, is the least trustworthy narrator of all? In literature, there's a trope, the unreliable first-person narrator, a character who tells the story from their perspective, only for the reader to later discover they were biased, misinformed, delusional, or lying the entire time. Think of Fight Club, Gone Girl, The Catcher in the Rye. These stories twist when the narrator's trust breaks. Suddenly, everything you believed becomes questionable. Every moment is reinterpreted. Now apply that to your own life. You are the first-person narrator of your story. You've always believed your version of events. But what if your memory is flawed, your perception biased, your emotions coloring the plot? What if your brain edits out contradictions, smooths over gaps, and delivers a clean narrative that just isn't true? Science supports this. In fact, your brain needs to be unreliable. It deletes sensory data that doesn't fit the story. It fills in blanks with guesses. It reorders timelines for clarity. It rationalizes irrational behavior. It suppresses uncomfortable truths. Not to deceive you, but to help you survive the chaos of being conscious. Here's a brutal example: confabulation. It happens when people with brain damage or memory loss create elaborate, false explanations for events they don't remember. They believe the story they're telling. They feel like they're telling the truth. but their brain is generating fiction on the fly to preserve the illusion of a continuous I. You do this too, just in subtler ways. You justify things after they happen. I lashed out because I was tired. I stayed because I still loved them. I quit because I knew it was time. These may be true, but often they're retrospective edits. Patches, comforting logic, written over raw instinct or impulsive action. And here's the twist. Every person you know is doing the same thing. Everyone's walking around as an unreliable narrator in a world full of other unreliable narrators. We're all telling stories that don't match, defending versions of ourselves that don't exist. This becomes especially dangerous when the story you tell yourself becomes absolute. I'm the victim. I'm the savior. I'm always right. I'm always wrong. These are not identities. They're roles, and once you believe them fully, the story controls you. You start filtering reality to support the script. You ignore facts that don't fit. You rewrite people to keep your plot intact. This is how delusion grows, not as madness, but as conviction. The strongest characters in fiction are often the most unreliable, because belief makes lies feel like truth. Now think about those moments where your narrative falters, when something happens that doesn't make sense in your story, a failure you didn't see coming, a betrayal that doesn't fit the arc, a success that feels unearned. What do? You rewrite. You reframe the failure as a lesson, the betrayal as my blind spot, the success as meant to be. The story repairs itself. The unreliable narrator becomes a compulsive editor, always stitching, always smoothing. But not everything can be edited. Some contradictions stay, some scenes haunt you because they break the narrative structure. You tell yourself, that's not who I am, and yet you did it, or that couldn't have happened, and yet it did. The tension between what happened and what fits the story becomes unbearable, so you do what unreliable narrators do best. You deny, you forget, you silence. But the story remembers. It seeps back through dreams, triggers, déjà vu. The unreliable narrator can suppress, but the plot has a way of circling back. Here's the irony. The only way to become more reliable is to admit that you're not, to stop treating the I as a prophet, to accept that your thoughts are not facts, that your perspective is just one lens, that your story, however compelling, isn't the only draft. And that's terrifying, because if you're not the one telling the truth, who is? Maybe no one. Maybe everyone. Maybe truth is less like a single narrative, and more like a collage of unreliable versions, layered together until something resembling meaning emerges. Or maybe the point isn't set to be reliable. Maybe the point is to keep reading, even when the narrator can't be trusted. So the next time you say, I know who I am, pause for a moment. Because the I who speaks might just be one chapter in a story still being written. There's a strange sensation you've probably felt before. A sense of repetition, not just of routine, but of something deeper. You're living a scene you've lived before, saying words you've already said, making the same mistake, feeling the same regret, chasing the same resolution, like your life is stuck on a page that keeps repeating itself. Welcome to the looping chapter. In any well-written story, chapters are meant to progress. Each one builds on the last. Characters evolve, stakes change, the world transforms. But sometimes, in life and in consciousness, the story doesn't move forward. It circles, rewinds, repeats, and the narrator keeps pretending it's new. You know the loops, the relationships you revisit even when they hurt, the habits you swear you've broken, the thoughts you can't stop thinking, this time will be different. Now I understand, this is the last time, and yet, you're right back in it, again. It starts not just behavioral, it starts structural. Neuroscientists call this rumination, a loop of thoughts that replay endlessly without resolution. The brain gets caught in cycles, like a scratched record. The same memory, the same fear, the same shame, not because you want to stay there, but because the brain is addicted to narrative closure. It keeps retelling the chapter, hoping to change the ending. But the ending never comes. In literature, a looping chapter can be used to trap a character. Think of Groundhog Day. Think of Russian Doll. The character wakes up and relives the same day, again and again. But here's the twist. The loop continues until the character learns something, until they change, until the story evolves. You live this too. Subconsciously, you repeat experiences, emotional dynamics, roles, decisions, trying to get it right this time. You keep revisiting the same emotional terrain as if you're looking for an exit. But what if there is no exit? What if the story isn't broken? It's recursive. Philosophers have wrestled with this idea for centuries. Nietzsche famously proposed the eternal return, the theory that you will live your exact life again, endlessly, forever. Every pain, every joy, every failure. Would you curse the loop or embrace it? Your mind hates loops. It longs for linearity, a beginning, a middle, an end. But consciousness often doesn't behave that way. It spirals. You think you've moved on, but you haven't. You think you've grown, only to fall into the same pattern. You think you're in a new chapter, but you're back at the start, with different scenery. And here's where it gets paradoxical. The more you try to escape the loop, the tighter it holds you. The story says, "This again?" The brain says, "Let's fix it." And so the loop continues. It's not just personal. Societies loop too. History repeats. Wars, ideologies, injustices. We act shocked, as if this wasn't the same chapter written in different ink. We call it new, but the structure is old. The characters have changed costumes, but the roles are the same. Even memory loops. You revisit moments, not to remember them, but to relive them. Regret becomes ritual. Nostalgia becomes a tether. The looping chapter isn't about time, it's about attention. Your consciousness returns, again and again, because something in that scene remains unfinished, or because the mind can't tolerate silence between scenes. Therapists often ask clients, "What's the story you keep telling?" It sounds simple, but it's a key to the loop. Maybe the story is, "I'm always the one who's left," or "Nothing I do is enough," or "I always mess things up." These aren't just thoughts, they're scripts, and they cue the next scene, again and again. The looping chapter lives in your language. You say, "Why does this always happen?" But the better question is, why does this story keep needing to be told? Sometimes, the loop serves a purpose. It protects you from moving into unfamiliar territory. The known pain feels safer than the unknown transformation. The loop is predictable, rehearsed, survivable. It keeps you contained. But the loop isn't set the prism. The narrator is the voice that says, "We are still here." The voice that says, "We haven't finished this part yet." The voice that says, "You stirred not allowed to turn the page." But what if you did? What if you allowed the chapter to end without resolution? What if you let the story remain unfinished? What if you stopped trying to rewrite the scene that broke you, and simply closed the book? Not everything needs a full arc. Not every loop needs an answer. Some stories don't evolve, they just stop. That's the danger of narrative identity. It convinces you that the story must make sense, that the loop has a lesson, that the pain has a payoff. But sometimes, the loop is just a glitch. And sometimes, letting go isn't closure, it's escape. So here you are, reading the same emotional line again, repeating the same inner monologue. And maybe this is the moment. You realize the page has no more ink. The chapter has been looping, because the story sits, waiting for you to stop reading it. You stir always in a scene. Right now, you're in one. There's a room around you, objects, sounds, the feeling of your body, sitting, lying, or walking. You may be alone or not. The light has a certain quality, the air has a certain temperature. This moment is a scene, and your mind, as always, is placing you in it. But here's the problem. You've mistaken the scene for the self. You look around and think, this is where I am, and by extension, this is who I am right now. But that's just set design, scenery, background. The mind quietly blends location, mood, posture, and external cues into your internal identity. A messy room makes you feel like a failure. A hospital hallway makes you feel fragile. A high-rise office makes you feel competent. You walk into different scenes and become different selves. This phenomenon is called context-dependent self-concept. It means your sense of identity isn't fixed. It fluctuates based on environment. You behave differently with a friend than with a boss. You think differently in a church than in a nightclub. You even speak in a different tone depending on the scene. The you that shows up isn't always the same character. That's not dysfunction. That's narrative survival. Every story requires setting, and your brain, being a born storyteller, assigns psychological meaning to place. A sunset becomes closure. A rainy day becomes grief. A hallway becomes a decision point. You're not just moving through space, you're narrating yourself through symbolic terrain. Now think about the scenes that shaped you. Your childhood bedroom, your high school cafeteria, the street where you had your first kiss. These aren't just locations, they're loaded with story, and the version of you that lived in them never truly left. When you return to those places, physically or in memory, you revert. You collapse into old lines, old feelings, old dialogue. Because to the brain, scene equals self. Even online, the scene shifts you. The social media timeline is a scene. You scroll through curated lives and your self reacts. Envy, insecurity, performance. You comment differently depending on the room you're in. Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, text messages. Each digital space cues a new version of the narrator. You might say, I'm just being myself. But which one? The self isn't a single entity moving through time. It's a fluid role reacting to set design. You are not who you are. You are where you are. The illusion of a stable me persists only because the transitions are fast and seamless, like camera cuts in a movie. And this has consequences. Because when you confuse the scene for the self, you begin to misinterpret your own story. You believe, I feel worthless, when really I'm in a scene that triggers worthlessness. You believe, I've changed, when really I've walked into a new environment. You believe, I can't escape this version of myself, when really I keep returning to the same set. This is why some people find transformation in travel, in nature, in silence. The self they thought was broken starts to vanish, not because they fixed themselves, but because the scene no longer supports the old story. The character has no role there. The script falls apart. And it's also why people regress when they return to old places. A visit home, a reunion, a childhood neighborhood. You find yourself slipping into old roles, saying things you thought you'd outgrown, feeling emotions that don't match your current identity. The story hijacks you because the set pieces haven't changed. So what does this mean? It means the self is porous, suggestible, scene-dependent. You're more like an actor than you'd like to admit, not in the sense of faking it, but in the sense of performing whatever the scene demands. But here's the twist. You rarely notice it, because the narrator keeps whispering, this is who I really am, even when that you changes 5 times a day. And maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe it's a form of wisdom. In some spiritual traditions, the self is seen as a mirror. It reflects what is around it. In that view, the goal isn't to find the true self. It's to stop clinging to any fixed version of it. To watch the scenes change without confusing them for truth. So try this. Instead of asking, who am I right now? Ask, where am I? And what version of me does this scene invite? And then ask, do I want to accept that role, or decline it? Because every scene hands you a script. But you don't have to read it. You can step off the stage, close the curtain, or rewrite the lighting altogether. Because in this theory, the self is not the story. It starts the way the story behaves. When the scenery changes, you've been told your whole life that you're the main character. It's baked into your language, your culture, your memories. Follow your dreams. This is your journey. You've got to do what's right for you. Every movie, book, game, and myth quietly whispers the same story. You're the center of the narrative. Everyone else is just a supporting role. It's comforting. It's empowering. But it's also, probably not true. Because the brutal, beautiful truth might be this. You're not the protagonist. Not of the story. Maybe not even of your story. You might just be a narrator of events you don't fully understand. A witness. A vessel. A subplot in someone else's arc. Or worse, a background character convincing themselves they're the star. Let's sticks dig in. The idea of the protagonist comes from storytelling. A single focal point. The hero. The one whose choices drive the plot. But real life isn't structured like that. No omniscient narrator, no guaranteed arc, no promise of resolution. Just billions of minds, each convinced they're the lead. This creates what's known in psychology as the egocentric bias. The belief that your experience is central, that others think about you as much as you think about yourself, that your presence carries the same emotional weight to others as it does to you. Spoiler, it doesn't. You remember the embarrassing thing you said 5 years ago? No one else does. You agonized over how to phrase that text. They skimmed it. You think your absence from that party changed everything. It didn't, because most of the time, you're not in other people's stories. Not really. At best, you're a recurring character. At worst, a one-liner they forgot by the next scene. That hurts, right? It feels like rejection, but it's also freedom. If you're not the protagonist, you're not carrying the weight of a full story. You're not obligated to make it all make sense. You're not required to win, to grow, to complete the arc. You can simply exist, imperfect, unfinished, unresolved, like a sentence that trails off. And let's not forget, your version of the story is just one. Every person you know sees you differently. To your parents, you're a child. To your ex, you're the villain. To your friend, you're the confidant. To the barista, you're a silent blur. To someone you've hurt, you're a plot twist. To someone you've helped, you're a footnote in their redemption arc. So who are you really? Not the protagonist. Not fully, because there are too many drafts of you floating around. Here's the deeper paradox. Your own mind isn't even aligned on your character. You believe different things about yourself, depending on mood, context, memory, time of day. In the morning, you're hopeful. At night, you're existential. After a failure, you're the tragic anti-hero. After praise, you're the rising star. Your internal protagonist keeps shape-shifting. That's not narrative clarity. That's narrative survival. And yet, you still cling to the idea that this is my story. You structure your days around goals, as if they were scenes. You interpret events symbolically. That happened for a reason. You try to extract meaning, like a reader, scanning for foreshadowing. But maybe there is no arc. Maybe you're just a story fragment, wandering through overlapping narratives. Sometimes you're center stage, sometimes you're scenery. So where does this leave you? It leaves you with the terrifying, liberating truth. You are not entitled to a satisfying plot. The universe doesn't owe you a character arc. Bad things might not lead to growth. Good things might not have meaning. Some chapters will just end mid-sentence, without closure. And that doesn't make your life worthless. It makes it real. Because here's the twist. When you stop trying to be the protagonist, you become something stranger, something freer, a living metaphor, a symbol in motion. You're no longer a character playing a role. You're a shifting presence within an unfolding, unknowable narrative. You can stop performing. You can stop narrating. You can just be. Let others cast you however they need. Let the scene write itself. Let the story wander. Because maybe you were never meant to be the protagonist. Maybe you were just meant to witness. And if there sits peace in that, then maybe that sips the plot twist after all. Stories are supposed to reveal truth. That's the whole idea, isn't it? We tell stories to understand things, to pass down wisdom, to share meaning. You've built your entire identity on a story you trust. But what happens when stories lie? Because they do. And often, the most believable ones are the biggest liars. Your mind doesn't just tell stories to entertain. It tells them to protect you, to regulate you, to keep you coherent. But coherence is not truth. Coherence is narrative symmetry, and symmetry often comes at the cost of reality. Take memory. You don't remember what happened. You remember the story you told yourself about what happened. And you've told it so many times that the original event is buried under interpretation. The moment was real. But the version you repeat? Edited, enhanced, distorted. And worse, some of the stories you carry were never yours to begin with. You inherited them. From your parents. From your culture. From systems designed to shape belief. Stories like, if I stum not productive, I stum worthless. If I set'm vulnerable, I set'm be hurt. If I've set'm different, I've set'll be alone. If I succeed, I set'll be loved. These aren't facts, they're scripts. Narratives passed down through language and reward, until they felt like personality. You didn't write them, but you've performed them so many times, they feel like your voice. This is the first lie, the belief that the story is you. It sits not. It's just a frame, a narrative lens, a structure you've mistaken for your skin. And because the story fits so tightly, you never question it. But then something cracks. You fail. You succeed and feel empty. You're loved but still lonely. The story lied. And that sits terrifying. Because if the story isn't true, then who are you? Many people respond by writing new stories. I used to be lost, but now I found myself. I used to be broken, now I'm healing. These are better stories, but they're still stories, still shapes drawn around chaos. And even these new stories lie. They simplify. They clean up. They round the edges of your pain so it fits on a page. They give your trauma a purpose it may never have had. They give your confusion a name that can be healing, but it can also be limiting. Because the second lie stories tell is this, that everything must make sense. Your brain hates randomness. It needs plot, so it connects dots that don't connect. It inserts motives where there were none. It assigns meaning to accidents. It builds mythologies out of moods. This happened because I deserved it. That was a sign. The universe is testing me. These are not truths. They're coping mechanisms with good PR. And it gets worse. Because stories don't just lie through language. They lie through silence. They leave things out. Whole chapters are redacted. Emotions never processed. Characters erased. Your story of what happened to me is probably missing the parts where you hurt others. Your story of what I overcame might skip over who paid the price for your success. The story is told from one angle. It omits. And omission is a lie dressed as clarity. Here's where it gets haunting. You believe these lies because they feel earned. You've told them so many times that they have emotional gravity. They feel true, but feeling isn't fact. Feeling is narrative weight, and you're carrying stories that never asked for your consent. This is what cognitive behavioral therapy tries to do. Challenge the story, unmask the lie, replace the inner monologue of I'm worthless with I'm struggling, and that's human. But even then, you're swapping one script for another, a healthier one, sure, but a story all the same. So what's the solution? Some say silence. Some say awareness. Some say letting go of the need for a story altogether. But letting go of story is like asking the ocean to stop being wet. You are made of narrative. Even the act of trying to escape the story becomes a story. I used to be trapped in a narrative. Now I'm free. That's just another chapter. So maybe the goal isn't set to escape the lie. Maybe it sits to see it. To hold the story gently. To acknowledge it as a version, not the truth. To allow it to change. To let other voices add their edits. To recognize that stories lie, not because they're evil, but because they're human. You can keep the story. But you don't have to believe everything it says. Because in this script, the biggest lie the story tells is that it's the only version that matters. There's something strange happening in the background of your life story. A presence you've never quite seen, but always felt. A quiet force moving behind the scenes, rearranging sentences, cutting paragraphs, redacting certain scenes, rewriting others entirely. It doesn't have a name. It doesn't announce itself, but it's always there. This is the ghost editor, the part of you that's always editing your story without your permission. You think you remember your past accurately, but you don't. You remember it in a way that supports your current identity. If today you feel strong, your memories of pain become tales of resilience. If today you feel broken, those same events become proof of lifelong fragility. Your past isn't fixed. It's reinterpreted daily. And who's doing that rewriting? The ghost editor. You don't see them, you don't hear them, but their fingerprints are everywhere. Why did you forget that one thing that happened when you were 12? Why do you now believe that your childhood was fine, even though parts of it clearly weren't? Why did that compliment that once mattered so much suddenly lose its weight? Edits. The ghost editor isn't malicious. It's protective. It cuts out scenes that hurt too much. It revises dialogue that no longer fits your arc. It tones down moments that once screamed, and amplifies whispers you didn't notice at the time, and you believe these new drafts as if they've always been true. It steps how you survive narrative dissonance. Because if the facts of your life clash too violently with your identity, the whole story threatens to collapse. So the ghost editor steps in with a red pen. Strike that, replace this. Let's never speak of that again. You see this in trauma. Survivors often block entire chapters from conscious memory, not because they're weak, but because the story can't continue unless the unbearable is edited out. Dissociation is not deletion, it's redaction. But the ghost editor works subtly in everyday life too. Ever notice how people retell stories with themselves as the hero, the victim, or the martyr, depending on who's listening? That's not vanity. That's editing. The mind unconsciously reshapes the story to align with the present self. The old version is discarded like an outdated manuscript. And it sits not just memory. The ghost editor messes with desire. A relationship that once felt like destiny now feels like a mistake. A dream you chased for years becomes something I never really wanted. You don't realize the revision happened. You just wake up one day, and the story's different. Even language shifts. Phrases you once used vanish. Words that felt true now feel foreign. The vocabulary of your old self is erased, and a new tone takes its place. This happens after trauma, after enlightenment, after heartbreak. A new narrator emerges, and with them, a new edit. Social media makes this even more visible. You curate your life, like an editor curates a novel. You delete posts that don't match your current aesthetic. You caption events with metaphors that reshape their meaning. You frame your story, not to reflect truth, but to maintain consistency. That's the ghost editor, working with a marketing budget. But here's the paradox. The ghost editor is you and not you. It's the part of your psyche that wants the story to flow, even if that means changing what really happened. You can't stop them, but you can notice them. That moment when you say, "That's not how I remember it," but realize you have no proof. That moment when a smell brings back a scene you forgot existed. That moment when you read an old journal and think, "Who wrote this?" That's when you catch the ghost editor mid-revision. And if you're honest, you might notice they've been editing all along. They edited out the things you didn't want to feel. They rewrote people into roles that made sense. They removed the nuance, so your story wouldn't break. But what gets lost in all these edits? Complexity, contradiction, depth, truth. The raw, uncomfortable, contradictory version of you that doesn't fit any neat arc. And yet, that messier draft, the one full of crossed-out lines and awkward phrasing, might be closer to the truth than the polished version you tell the world. So how do you live with the ghost editor? You don't fight them. You read with awareness. You highlight the footnotes they tried to delete. You acknowledge the missing pages. You remember that every story is a draft. And some drafts are meant to remain unfinished. Because maybe the story of you was never meant to be perfected. Maybe it was only ever meant to be honest. And honesty, in its rawest form, doesn't always pass through editing. There sets a voice in your head. You hear it now, don't hate you. It speaks in your language, your cadence. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it roars, sometimes it argues with itself. But it never truly goes silent. It tells you who you are, what to fear, what to remember, and what to want. You've grown so used to it that you call it me. But have you ever asked, where is it coming from? Because for something so constant, so defining, that inner voice has no clear source. It arises, speaks, and vanishes. It does not ask permission. It does not always make sense. It is a presence without a body, a narrator without an author. This is the mystery of the voice without source. The experience of thought appearing inside your consciousness fully formed, as if spoken by someone, or no one, or everyone you've ever heard, blended into one convincing monologue. And still, you believe it, because it sounds like you. But is it? Most people never question the voice. Why would they? It speaks in the first person. It seems to know your memories, your values, your fears. But if you really listen, you'll notice it doesn't speak for you. It speaks to you. And sometimes, it says things you would never dare say aloud. You sit disgusting. They don't care about you. You said are going to fail. You stir, faking it. Who is saying that? You don't want to believe those things. You wouldn't say them to a friend. Yet, there they are, looping in your mind, unsolicited, unstoppable. In cognitive science, these are known as automatic thoughts, streams of internal dialogue that arise without conscious effort. They don't come from logic. They emerge from emotion, habit, trauma, repetition, and yet they hold power over your self-perception. Because you assume that if a voice speaks inside your mind, it must be yours. But voices can be implanted. Childhood conditioning, cultural expectations, religious guilt, parental judgment. Echoes from a bully sip's taunt long ago. A teacher sips disappointment. A partner sips manipulation. You absorb those voices. Your brain records them. And over time, the lines get blurry. You repeat their lines until they sound like your own. That's the trick. The voice has no face. so it can wear any mask. It can say, "I'm just being honest," when it's really just being cruel. It can say, "I'm trying to protect you," when it's really keeping you small. It can say, "This is who you are," when it's really just looping a line from someone else's story. And even when you recognize the voice as harmful, you struggle to let go of it, because silence feels more dangerous. Silence feels like a blank page. At least the voice gives you structure. At least it feels like continuity. But continuity is not clarity. The voice often contradicts itself. It tells you to be brave, then punishes you for failing. It tells you to be kind, then mocks you for being weak. It tells you to be authentic, then edits your every word before you speak. And you obey. Because deep down you're afraid, if I don't listen to this voice, what's left? That's the trap. The voice becomes the self. The narrator becomes the identity. The story becomes the truth. But what if you could pause? What if you could notice the space between hearing the voice and obeying it? Mindfulness practices teach exactly this. Not to silence the voice, but to watch it, observe it, disidentify from it, to hear a thought arise, and simply say, "There sips a thought." Not "that sips me," just "that sips a sentence." And when you do this, something strange happens. The voice loses power. It begins to sound less like truth and more like a character, a loop, a ghost, and in that gap between the voice and the awareness of it, you appear. Not the narrative self, not the ego, but the quiet, expansive, witnessing consciousness that doesn't need to say a thing. Because real awareness has no language. It doesn't speak. It listens. This is what mystics and philosophers have pointed to for centuries, that the true self is not the voice in your head. It's the space that hears it, that watches it rise and fall like waves on an ocean. But you've been so deeply conditioned to trust the voice, to follow the monologue, that the silence beneath it feels invisible, or worse, like nothing. But it isn't nothing. It sits everything. Because when the voice goes quiet, when it finally loses the mic, what sits left is not absence. It sits presence. Pure, wordless, formless being. So the next time the voice says, "You still never be enough," or "You have to figure it out," or "This is who you are," just listen. Not to believe it, but to recognize that it has no source. It just arises. And the moment you stop narrating it, it fades. Like breath in cold air. Like a line on a page. With no author sip's name. Every good story has continuity. A through line. A sense of progression that makes the character feel real, believable, coherent. And you've built your own identity the same way, by stitching together moments, decisions, beliefs and memories into something that feels consistent. But if you look closely, you find gaps, contradictions, jumps, illogical shifts, sudden changes in character that don't quite add up, inconsistencies you can't explain. These are plot holes in identity, places where the story of you breaks down, but you keep telling it anyway. And most of the time, you don't even notice. Because your brain is designed to protect the illusion of a seamless self. It edits, it rearranges, it covers up, it lies beautifully and efficiently. And the result? A story that feels whole but isn't. Have you ever looked back at an old version of yourself and thought, who even was that? Have you ever found yourself justifying choices you once judged in others? Have you ever had a moment of clarity where you suddenly realized your beliefs don't match your behavior? That sip's not hypocrisy. That sip's narrative tension. Because your identity, yourself, is not a fixed truth. It's a story being revised in real time. And like all stories under constant revision, it develops cracks. These cracks are everywhere. Like the time you claimed to value honesty, but told a lie to protect yourself. Or the time you prided yourself on independence, but stayed in a relationship out of fear. Or the way you describe your childhood as happy, while quietly avoiding certain memories. Your life is filled with scenes that don't fit your self-concept. So what happens to them? You delete them. Or worse, you rewrite them. You say, "I didn't mean it." Or, "That sip's not who I really am." Or, "I was going through a lot." These aren't sip-to lies. They sip-to edits. Narrative repairs. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. The discomfort you feel when your actions and identity don't align. And to resolve that discomfort, your mind rewrites the story, not the behavior. The plot hole gets patched, not with truth, but with story glue. And the more you do this, the more fragile the narrative becomes. Because eventually the story stops being about truth and starts being about coherence. And coherence is a slippery thing. It demands order where there is none. It smooths chaos into false clarity. This is why people sometimes have identity crises. Not because something shattered them, but because too many plot holes stacked up. The story couldn't hold itself together anymore. The character arc broke under the weight of too many revisions. You say, I don't know who I am anymore. But what you really mean is, the story I've been telling no longer matches what I've lived. And that's a terrifying feeling. Because you've been taught that a strong identity is consistent, that growth should follow a neat line, that change should be part of a carefully designed arc. But real life doesn't work that way. In reality, people contradict themselves constantly. They change their minds. They act out of character. They evolve in ways that make their past selves unrecognizable. That's not bad writing. That's the human condition. But here's the trouble. When your identity is wrapped around a story, these contradictions feel like failures. They feel like betrayals of the narrative. So you scramble to explain them, to fit them in, to fill the plot holes before someone else notices. But what if you stopped trying? What if you allowed the holes to exist? What if your identity didn't have to make perfect sense? What if your character arc was a mess, non-linear, contradictory, jagged, and that was fine? Because in truth, the you believe in is more like an anthology than a novel, a collection of drafts, a chorus of voices, some of them loud, some quiet, some that return, others that vanish. And when you realize that, when you stop fighting the plot holes, you open yourself to a different kind of self. A self that doesn't need to be explained. A self that doesn't fit a structure. A self that exists not as a story, but as a presence, ever-changing, always becoming. So, next time you stumble into a contradiction, pause. Don't rush to edit. Don't explain it away. Just notice it. That's not a flaw in your story. That's a reminder that the story was never the whole truth to begin with. Because in the end, the most honest thing you can say about yourself is this: I don't always make sense. And maybe that's the only plotline worth trusting. In every story you've ever read, setting matters. The swamp makes the hero cautious. The throne room makes the villain bolder. The battlefield turns ordinary people into legends. But somehow, when it comes to your own life, you forget this. You believe your identity comes from the inside out, that you are who you are, no matter where you go. But what if that's not true? What if the setting creates you? You change in different rooms. That's not opinion, it's neuroscience. Your posture shifts. Your voice adapts. Your thoughts recalibrate. There is no such thing as the real you, independent of context. Instead, there is a fluid self that emerges depending on the environment. You act like someone else in front of your parents. You speak differently at work than you do with friends. You might cry in a bedroom, but smile in a crowd. The person you were at 2 a.m. alone is not the person you were in sunlight at noon. It's not inauthenticity. It's contextual identity, the mind adapting to fit the set it's dropped into. Walk into a hospital, and you feel small. Walk into a stage-lit room, and you feel seen. Walk into an airport, and suddenly you're in motion, even when sitting still. A forest humbles you. A classroom alerts you. A graveyard silences you. Every space writes you differently. In psychology, this is tied to situational priming, a phenomenon where the environment cues certain mental and emotional responses. You aren't just in a setting. The setting is inside you. It reshapes the way your neurons fire. It alters your language, your pace, your sense of time. And this doesn't just apply to physical space. Emotional settings matter too. You might be in the same room but feel entirely different when you're in love, in fear, in grief. A room filled with joy feels wide. A room filled with shame feels suffocating. And the you who emerges in each version, drastically different. This is why people change when they leave home, or travel, or live alone for the first time. The setting isn't just background. It's a sculptor. It carves the self in real time. Now think about how you design your own scenes. The clothes you wear, the music you play, the objects you surround yourself with. You're not just decorating, you're narrating. You're shaping the setting to reflect the version of you that feels safe, or expressive, or in control. And sometimes, when life feels unbearable, it's not you that's broken, it's the scene. You're playing a character that doesn't belong to that environment anymore. A soft-hearted person in a hard world, a dreamer in a cubicle, a poet in a fluorescent-lit office. You say, I feel lost, but what you might really mean is this scene doesn't know how to write me. This is why moving out of a toxic environment can feel like rebirth. It's not magic. It's not sudden courage. It's just a new set. And in that new set, the character adjusts. You start saying things you didn't know you believed. You start laughing in ways you forgot you could. You start breathing like the scene finally fits. And yet, we underestimate this. We blame ourselves instead. You think, why am I so anxious all the time? But never ask, what if this room, this rhythm, this social atmosphere, is writing me as an anxious character? You think, why can set time move forward? But never ask, does this setting allow me to grow, or does it keep handing me the same script? Even your thoughts are affected by the weather, the lighting, the color of the walls, the presence or absence of background noise. These aren't trivial, they're narrative inputs. They change the tone of your monologue. They create plot. Consider this. Most major revelations in fiction happen after a change in setting. The desert, the forest, the rooftop, the dream. The space where old stories dissolve and new language finds you. You don't need to force transformation. Sometimes you just need to step into a different room. So what does this mean for you, here and now? It means that identity is not a static truth, but a scene-dependent expression. It means that the you you've been struggling to understand may only exist in a certain context, and maybe that context hasn't found you yet. It also means you have more agency than you think. You can rearrange the setting, move the furniture, change the soundtrack, open the window, step outside. You don't have to rewrite yourself from scratch. You just have to walk into a scene that lets a different version of you emerge. Because the self is not fixed. It's atmospheric. It rises with the temperature. It drifts with the light. It flows with the architecture of the moment. And maybe the reason your story feels stuck is because you've been reading the same page, in the same room, for far too long. Here's something strange you've never questioned when you think a thought. How do you know it's yours? You feel something. Then a voice labels it. A sentence rises. An explanation forms. You tell yourself, I'm anxious because of work, or I don't trust people anymore, or I'm just not good at this. And it feels original. It feels like truth. But what if it's not? What if every thought is a quote, a line borrowed, rehearsed, and repeated so often that the quotation marks vanished? Your thoughts didn't appear out of nowhere. They were planted. By a parent sip's offhand comment. By a teacher sep's tone. By a lover sep's silence. By 1,000 ads, movies, posts, and norms that shaped the way you speak to yourself. And over time, the source faded. But the sentence stayed. You think you're thinking, but in reality, you're repeating. This is known in psychology as introjection, the unconscious adoption of beliefs and attitudes from others. The mind internalizes external voices and stores them as if they were your own. So that thought in your head, you'll never succeed, or you need to be better, or destem, people always leave. You didn't invent it, you inherited it. Somewhere along the way, you heard it, absorbed it, and forgot where it came from. But it sits still running in the background, like a plagiarized script you never realized wasn't yours. And this doesn't only apply to negative thoughts. Even your strengths might be echoes, the confidence you carry, the words you use to describe yourself, the beliefs you cling to. What if they sip all second-hand, a remix of voices layered together, presented as you? This is why when people go to therapy, or meditate, or journal deeply, they often have the same revelation. Wait, I don't actually believe this. Because sometimes, you finally see the quotation marks. You recognize the voice. That sip's not me. That sip's my father. That sip's that one teacher. That sip's the church. That sip's the ex who broke me. That sip's the system I grew up in. And suddenly, the thought loses its weight. Because once you see it's a quote, it no longer defines you. It becomes just a sentence. But here's the catch. Most of your inner life is composed of these silent quotations. your opinions, your fears, even your dreams. You don't dream in a vacuum, you dream in tropes, in stories you've been told about what matters. Success, love, meaning, beauty. Your image of these is constructed from borrowed language. The self, then, isn't stit a source. It sips a collage, and that sip's not a bad thing. It sits just not what you were told. You were told that thinking is a sign of individuality, that your thoughts are sacred, that your mind is your own. But that's only partly true, because if you examine each thought closely, you'll find fingerprints, authors, editors, censors. Even the way you explain your pain is inherited. You say, I have trust issues, but where did that phrase come from? A meme? A friend? A TikTok voiceover? Do you even know what it really means to you? Or is it just a phrase that matched the feeling, so you adopted it? Language makes emotion legible, but it also distorts it. Once you name something, you limit it. You turn a storm into a forecast. You turn grief into depression. You turn curiosity into overthinking. And in doing so, you start living inside the metaphor, instead of the moment. You become the quote. Even silence quotes something. The quiet between thoughts often holds the remnants of a sentence you never dared say aloud, and still, it shapes you, because you don't just think thoughts, you are moved by them. You act on them. You suffer under their weight. But what if you paused? What if, the next time a thought arose, especially one that felt heavy, sharp, defining, you asked, who said that first? Where did I learn that phrase? Is this a belief or a script? Is this a truth or a quote with the source ripped off? You might find something shocking, that your mind is a library, that your thoughts are books others wrote, that your self-narration is full of footnotes you never cited. And in that moment of awareness, something changes. You don't need to silence the voice. You just need to attribute it. Oh, that sips the voice of fear quoting my mother sips expectations. Oh, that sips capitalism quoting productivity as worth. Oh, that sips my inner child quoting survival. And once you do that, you create space. Space to ask, what do I actually think? If I wasn't quoting anyone, what would my mind sound like? Maybe it wouldn't sound like anything. Maybe it would just be a breath, a pause, a quiet presence unburdened by borrowed language. That sips not silence. That sips authorship. Because in this theory, you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness that notices. Every thought is quoted, and not all of them deserve to be repeated. You have probably thought this before. I have changed. The truth is, you've never been just one version of yourself. You've lived as a dozen different people, maybe more. You've been kind and cruel, hopeful and jaded, shy and shameless, a villain in one story and a hero in another. And yet you try to package all that contradiction into a single clean identity. But the truth is, harder and more freeing, you are not a finished self. You are a series of drafts. Each relationship, an edit. Each failure, a rewritten paragraph. Each awakening, a deleted chapter. But you weren't taught to think of yourself as a draft. You were taught to be consistent, to be sure, to define yourself. This is who I am. As if the story is done. As if your character is locked. But if you were truly consistent, you wouldn't have survived. You had to adapt. You had to change your mind. You had to kill off previous versions of yourself just to keep breathing. And those versions, they're still in the margins. The version of you who believed in magic. The one who gave too much. The one who smiled while falling apart. The one who fought everything. The one who ran. The one who stayed. They weren't Sit's mistakes. They were drafts. Incomplete? Of course. Contradictory? Always. But necessary? Absolutely. In writing, a draft is not failure. It's foundation. It holds the shape of what might be. It's messy, repetitive, overwritten, but essential. And it's only with time, distance, and clarity that the writer decides what stays and what gets cut. You've been doing this all along. You set rewritten how you see the world. You have revised what you tolerate. You have redrafted your boundaries. You have restructured your faith. You have edited out beliefs that were never yours. And sometimes without even knowing it, you've scrapped whole versions of yourself overnight in the name of survival. But here sips the paradox. Even your final self is temporary. Even your most authentic version is just another draft. You say, found myself. But who's to say tomorrow's version won't disagree? The Buddhists call this impermanence. Neuroscience calls it plasticity. Writers just call it rewriting. It's why people you haven't seen in years say, "You've changed," and it startles you because they're still reading an earlier draft. One you stopped editing long ago, and maybe they loved that version, or hated it, or misunderstood it. But it doesn't matter, that draft is done. And yet, those drafts live on. Not in control, but in echo. You hear them in old journal entries. In songs that used to make sense. In decisions that no longer fit your current plot. Sometimes, they sneak back in. When you're tired, lonely, triggered. Suddenly, you're reacting like draft 4 or draft 11, and you judge yourself. I thought I was past this, but you weren't failing. You were revisiting a scene. Because drafts don't disappear. They stack. Layered, archived, marked up with invisible ink. You're not replacing the old selves. You're living among them. And that can be overwhelming, especially when you're trying to find clarity, trying to pin yourself down. People want certainty. Who are you? What do you believe? What do you want? But if you are honest, you will say, I'm still being written. And maybe that sips the truest answer. Because trying to finalize yourself is the fastest way to betray who you're becoming. It locks the story too early. It silences new paragraphs. It ignores the evolution mid-sentence. Sometimes you write confidently. Sometimes you revise endlessly. Sometimes you throw out the whole chapter and start again. And that sip's okay. You're still not supposed to be polished. You're still supposed to be real. So what do you do with the old drafts? You honor them. You read them with kindness. You highlight what helped. You strike through what harmed. You thank them for what they were trying to do, even if they failed. Because even the worst draft was doing its best with what it knew. And here sips the strangest part. Even this version, this moment, this you reading these words, will soon be just another draft. Outdated, incomplete, slightly embarrassing, and yet still worthy of love. Because you are not a final product. You are a living manuscript. And the most honest thing you can say is, this is where I am in the story today. You stir not alone in your mind. Even when no one sits around, someone sits watching. When you make a mistake, someone reacts. When you get praised, someone claps or rolls their eyes. When you cry, someone comments. And when you succeed, someone whispers, you don't deserve this. There sits no crowd in the room. No camera. No one actually listening. And yet in your mind, you feel observed, judged, graded. That's because you live with an internal audience, a silent, imaginary group that reviews everything you do. You think you living your life, but you steer also performing it. All the time. Psychologists call this the imaginary audience effect. The belief that others are constantly noticing and evaluating you. It begins in adolescence, but for many it never really stops. Because at some point, your mind internalized the gaze of others. And now, even when they're gone, their eyes remain. Not real ones, imagined ones. You carry them with you. The parent who expected too much. The teacher who scolded. The friend you always tried to impress. The crush you wanted to notice you. The version of society you created in your head. You live your story while being watched by this invisible committee. You dress not just to wear clothes, but to be seen wearing them. You speak not just to express, but to be heard saying the right thing. You suffer not just in pain, but with the awareness that someone might be reading your suffering like a plot twist. Even when you sit alone, the audience remains. It cheers when you sit productive. It frowns when you rest. It offers commentary you didn't ask for. And you, the main character, can't help but wonder what they think, even though they don't exist. This internal audience shapes the way your story unfolds. You avoid risks, not because you're afraid of failing, but because you're afraid of being seen failing. You over-explain, not because someone demanded it, but because your audience wouldn't get it otherwise. You even suffer more privately because your inner critics won't approve of how you cope. The irony. You are the actor. The stage. The playwright. And the entire audience, all at once. You created this theater in your mind, and now you're trapped performing in it. And sometimes, the audience splits. There's the admiring section, the part that wants you to shine, that cheers for growth. But there's also the cynical section, the one that boos you before you speak, that questions your every step. You try to impress one while hiding from the other. Exhausting, isn't it? Because no matter what you do, someone in that crowd is disappointed. Even if that someone is just a phantom in your psyche. But here's the unsettling part. You often believe the audience more than you believe yourself. You trust their imagined disapproval more than your own intuition. You value their imaginary standards more than your inner knowing. You let ghosts dictate the plot. Why? Because stories are meant to be shared. And without an audience, the story feels incomplete. So your mind makes one up. Even loneliness has an audience. You cry, then wonder what the world would say if it could see you crying. You isolate, but think, if they only knew how much I'm hurting. You tell the story even when no one sits listening. Because the telling itself needs witnesses, even imaginary ones. So how do you live with this audience? You can sit to evict them. You can set to race decades of inner spectatorship. But you can change the script. You can notice who sits sitting in the front row. Is it a disappointed parent? A critical ex? A younger you who doesn't understand yet? Then, invite someone new in. A quieter voice. A kinder presence. Maybe even an empty seat. Let silence watch you for a while. And most importantly, ask this. What would I do if no one was watching? Not even in my mind. Because behind the audience, behind the performance, behind the endless commentary, there's a different kind of presence. One that doesn't judge or applaud. Just witnesses. Just is. That's where the real story begins. Not with the lines you rehearsed. Not with the reaction you hoped for. But with the moment you stopped playing a role and started listening to the silence beneath the stage. Not just the letters on your ID. Not just the sound people use when they call you. What sips your name? But the word that shaped your entire existence. The one you learned to answer to, obey, defend, and define yourself by. It stops the first line of your script. Because here's the strange truth. Your name isn't just a label, it's a dialogue. Your name didn't just identify you, it constructed you. You didn't choose it. It was given, spoken into you before you understood what words even were. And from that moment on, every interaction you had was built on that word, spoken aloud, written down, whispered in memory. That's me, you learned to say. But what does that actually mean? It became a trigger for roles, expectations, emotions, responsibilities. Your name got called, became, you got in trouble. They said your name became you felt seen. The word echoed, again and again, until the sound became inseparable from the person. But the name isn't a person. It sups a sound, a shape in language, a placeholder in narrative. And yet, you believe in it completely. You react when someone says it across a noisy room. You feel things when it's said in certain tones. You feel warmth, guilt, shame, pride, just from hearing yourself named. Why? Because that word has never been neutral. It's been wrapped in context, shaped by history, charged with energy, written in love letters, typed in reports. Its steps been spoken in arguments, yelled in pain, cried in grief. And now it carries all of that. In your parents' mouths, it meant promise. Every time someone says it, they're referencing a story you've been trying to write since birth. But the name never meant one thing. In a stranger sits, it might mean politeness. In a lover sits, it meant intimacy. In your own mind it might mean everything, or nothing. Because eventually, you start speaking your name to yourself. I can do this. I hate myself. The name becomes internal dialogue. You're not just being spoken to, you're speaking back, performing identity through language that began before you had a say in it. I said I'm proud of me. And here's where it gets surreal. You've never truly heard your name without story attached. Try to hear it now in your mind. Say it without memory, without emotion, without association. Impossible, right? Because the name is a script. And you still have never heard it unscripted. Now consider this. Some people change their name. Why? You've only ever heard it through the filter of the character you're playing. Because they need a new story. Because the old word held too much pain. because the role they were assigned at birth no longer fits the person they've become, because the voice that used to answer to that name no longer lives here. But even the new name becomes story. It becomes a new dialogue, a new sound attached to a new self, not a replacement, but a rewrite. Others go by many names, online, in different languages, in private and in public, each one activating a different voice, a different tone, a different version of the character. The self is fluid, but the name anchors it in language. And that sips the paradox. Your name feels like your most personal possession, but it sips also your most public. It belongs to you, and to anyone who's ever spoken it. It is used to summon you, to locate you in space, to assign blame, to give credit, to exclude. Your name is how people tell their story of you, to include. And in that sentence, you carry every version of you that's ever existed. But it's also how you tell your story to yourself. You say, I am name. The child, the rebel, the success, the disappointment, the dream, the regret. So what does it mean? All packed into a single word. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe your name is just a metaphor for being. Only felt. Only pointed at. Maybe the real self can be named. You'll keep trying to make it mean something worth remembering. You still keep answering to it. But while you're here in this world, in this story, in this voice, you'll keep saying it. But they echo. Because names are just dialogue. And that sips okay? And sometimes, that echo, someone was here, is the only way we know. Do you really make choices? Free will. It feels so obvious. You decide what to eat. You choose when to speak. You turn left instead of right. Your thoughts are yours, right? Or are you just playing the role the script gave you? That sips how story works. Because every character believes they have agency, even the ones in books. Hamlet chooses to act mad. Frodo decides to take the ring, but those decisions, already written, already bound to pages they can't read. They feel real, because they must. But what if all of it is just narrative illusion? Your brain is built to make sense of chaos through story structure, beginning, middle, end. And in that structure, the idea of choice is the glue that keeps the illusion intact. And here sits the trap. So does your mind. You need to feel like you're choosing, so the story feels alive. But what if that choice was already chosen? Think of every moment in your life that felt like a turning point. Now look closer. How many of those decisions were built on past experiences, beliefs, emotions, patterns you didn't fully choose? How many were reactions to environments, traumas, praise, fear, or the expectations of others? You didn't set right your childhood. You didn't design your brain chemistry. You didn't script your fears. You didn't even pick your language. So who sips really deciding? And yet, all of these shape what feels like a decision. Neuroscience shows that many decisions are made in the brain milliseconds before you're even consciously aware of them. The you who thinks it's choosing is often just narrating what's already happened. Like a character explaining its own behavior while the plot moves ahead. Your will is real, but your free will? It's fiction. Maybe not as free as you think. Because if you stopped believing in your autonomy completely, the story would collapse. But necessary fiction. There'd be no responsibility. No achievement. No arc. So instead, your mind builds a convincing performance. It fills in gaps. Rationalizes what it didn't plan. Adds meaning after the fact. Or so you can say, I chose this. Claims authorship over actions it didn't initiate. But here's where it gets more paradoxical. Your script is written in real time by a combination of biology, history, culture, memory, and randomness. You do make choices, but within constraints. You didn't choose. Your character can improvise, but only inside the limits of its world. Like a video game character with a dialogue wheel. Like a dream where you can fly, but only because the dream decided that was the rule. And then you call it freedom. Still, it feels free. Because the script allows for illusion. Because the character needs to believe it matters. Because if you knew you were just following lines, what would be the point? And that sits the beauty of it. Fictional free will is still meaningful. Still makes us cry. Just like a written character still moves us. Still inspires. They don't sit have freedom, but they still have impact. So maybe your story doesn't need to be fully unscripted to be beautiful. To realize you sit in a scene, to see the cues. Maybe the point isn't to escape the narrative, but to become conscious inside of it. This is that part in the story where I grow. To step back and say, to feel the rhythm of the arc. This is the twist. And then, instead of resisting, this is the dark chapter. You choose not to break the script, but to dance with it. You won't escape the story. You move through it consciously. Because freedom might not be the absence of limits, but you can read it while living it. And that sips its own kind of liberation. But you are also the reader. You are a character. But the awareness of the ones you have. You can still choose how to read the next line. And even if the story is writing you, but because without conflict there is no character, there sits a reason every story needs conflict. Not just for suspense, not just for tension. No struggle, no transformation. No push, no arc. No resistance, no revelation. And whether you realize it or not, your entire self is made from the conflicts you've endured. Not just dramatic ones. Even the quiet ones. The inner tensions. The contradictions you had to reconcile. The moments you wanted two things at once and had to pick which version of you to become. And every choice becomes a line in your script. And every fork demands a choice. Real or illusory. Because every conflict creates a fork in the road. But let's step back. Ask yourself, who would you be if nothing ever challenged you? If you never experienced failure? If no one ever disagreed with you? If the world conformed to every preference, every desire? Would you even recognize yourself? Because we don't discover who we are through ease. We discover it when something breaks the pattern. Conflict is the test that reveals the hidden blueprint. It's the moment the story stops gliding forward and forces a shift. And in that moment, you meet a new version of you. Think back to your darkest hour. That you stir stronger than you thought? What did it make you realize about yourself? That you sit more fragile than you admitted? That your beliefs weren't as unshakable as you hoped? Whatever it showed you something. And you carried that forward. But here sits the twist. You often resist conflict. You avoid pain, tension, contradiction. Like a character who doesn't want to face the truth. And yet, these are the very forces that sculpt your identity. Until the plot makes it unavoidable. And the more profound the conflict, the more profound the transformation. A loss forces you to examine what you value. A betrayal teaches you what loyalty means. Even internal tension, between who you are and who you want to be, writes itself into your emotional DNA. But here's the paradox. A moral dilemma makes you define your ethics. So what does the mind do? The story needs conflict, but the self resists it. It rewrites. About who was right. It tells itself stories about the conflict. About why it happened. You need the story to make sense. About what it meant. Not to distort reality, but to maintain narrative cohesion. Even if that means revising your past. You need to emerge as the person you can live with. Even if that means villainizing others. And it changed you. Even if that means pretending the conflict never happened. But the truth is, it did happen. Maybe it hardened you. Maybe it softened you. And now that version of you is part of the character's arc. Maybe it shut you down. Maybe it woke you up. But the version of you now, the one reading this, is built from every conflict survived, every contradiction navigated, every unresolved tension buried in the narrative soil of your being. And even the ones you think you outgrown? A childhood rivalry. They still writing you. A parental wound. A failure you laugh off but secretly fear repeating. A betrayal you thought you forgot. These conflicts don't vanish. They echo. They shape the voice you use when you speak to yourself. They define what you think you deserve. So maybe the goal isn't set to avoid conflict. They construct the story of who you believe you are. Maybe the goal is to listen to what it's revealing. Because every character arc is built on tension. And yours is no different. You are the plot twist. The story never saw coming. You are not the peaceful stasis. You are the movement between fractures. You are the unresolved question that keeps the next page turning. And every time you face a new conflict, internal or external, you aren't just surviving. You are the storm, and the I within it. You're turning the static self into a dynamic narrative. You stir becoming. You stir rewriting. So the next time it hurts, the next time something breaks, the next time you feel pulled apart, this isn't set, the end. Remember, this is the part where your character changes, until the ending changes everything. You think you know the meaning of a moment. It sips one of the oldest tricks in storytelling. What felt like a tragedy becomes a gift in hindsight. What you thought was kindness turns out to be manipulation. What looked like a meaningless scene was actually foreshadowing all along. And your life? It works the same way. Because the ending of a chapter, whether it's a relationship, a job, a year, a phase, has a strange power. It casts shadows backwards. It rewrites what came before. It gives past events a new shape, a new lens, a new emotion. Let's say you leave a job you hated. At first, the frustration felt pointless, but once you're out, you realize every hardship was part of what gave you the courage to quit. Now, those terrible days, they weren't random, they were catalysts. And suddenly, the middle of the story reads differently. That sips how endings work. They still retroactive authors. The final scene doesn't just close the story, it interprets it. And your mind, desperate for cohesion, plays along. You go back and mentally annotate what happened. You search for signs. This is why breakups feel like re-edits. You find meaning you didn't see before, because now the ending demands it. You reshape characters. The past isn't set fixed. Why success makes the struggle feel noble, while failure makes it feel foolish. Why death makes you rethink a whole relationship. It sits elastic. You remember the journey not as it was, but as the ending allows. And endings pull it into new forms. And here sits the paradox. Even while you're living the middle, the ending is already whispering to it. Not because it's predetermined, but because your mind can sit help but foreshadow. It imagines future resolutions that will justify the present pain. It searches for patterns, setups, callbacks. You tell yourself, one day this will all make sense. Or maybe this is the start of something. Even before the ending comes, your brain is trying to predict it, so it can give the middle weight, or it shatters them. But when the actual ending arrives, it either affirms those expectations, the smiles that weren't set genuine, and that shattering can be liberating or devastating, because it forces you to reread everything. The decisions you thought were right, but only made sense under the old narrative. The opportunities you didn't recognize. This is why people revisit journals, old messages, photos, trying to understand what really happened. They're not just reminiscing, they're reauthoring. Because memory is pliable, and the brain wants story to make sense, even if it has to rewrite the past to get there. And they still find what they need. So what does this mean for you right now, in the middle of your story? It means you don't really know what this moment means. Not yet. Not until the next chapter. That painful silence you sitting in? Not until the future tells you how to read it. It might become the pivot you thank later. It might be the origin of your greatest clarity. That rejection you just faced. But here sits the secret. That feeling of being lost. It might turn out to be the only way you ever find yourself. Not always in outcome, life is wild like that. But in interpretation, you can choose the ending. You can write the ending that makes this middle worth it. You can decide what this chapter will mean later. Because sometimes the meaning doesn't live in the event. And you are the narrator, even if you didn't write the plot. It lives in the narration. So when things feel incomplete, unresolved, incoherent, don't rush to judge the story. Because one day, you'll look back. Just turn the page. And this moment, this strange in-between chapter, will make more sense than you ever imagined. Ah, that's what that was for. And you still whisper to yourself, let's be honest, whatever truth is, it gets filtered. And the first place it gets filtered is through the narrator. In your case? But here sits a dangerous question. That sips the voice in your head. Can you trust the narrator of your own life? Because every story, even the one you call your identity, has a narrator who isn't just telling the tale. They stir shaping it, framing it. And that narrator isn't neutral, editing it in real time. It has biases. It wants to protect you from shame. It wants coherence. It wants you to look like the protagonist, not the problem, or sometimes punish you with it. You don't just remember events, you narrate them. You cast people in roles. You give tone and motive to what might have been random. You emphasize certain details. You leave others out. You tell yourself things like, "They never cared. I always do this." But those aren't sipped facts. This is just who I am. They sub a narration. And narration isn't truth. It's perspective with rhythm. It sips memory given mood. It sips emotion pretending to be evidence. What you call truth is often just the prosecution's story. The defense rarely gets a voice. Let sips imagine your mind like a courtroom drama. This is why people can have wildly different stories about the same event. And the judge? That's still you pretending to be neutral while holding a gavel of emotional bias. The witnesses, your memories. Different truth. Different narrator. Same day, same facts. So now ask yourself, what if the version of your life you're telling isn't the only version that could be told? Maybe the one where you're a failure isn't the only edit. Maybe the one where they abandoned you isn't the full draft. And like any narrator in literature, yours might be unreliable. Maybe the one where you're broken isn't a fact. It's just the current narrator's monologue. Not out of malice, but because it sips human. It forgets. It distorts. It protects. It assigns meaning where there was chaos. It adds foreshadowing where there was none. It repeats itself. And worst of all, it gives finality to things still unfolding. The same stories, again and again. You stim not enough. This always happens to you. No one really understands. These aren't sept truths. They sit were well-rehearsed scripts. Just for a moment. Spoken so often they feel like facts. But, pause. What happens when you switch from tragedy to resilience? Not the events, just the voice telling the events. What if you changed the narrator sip's tone? Suddenly, I failed becomes I stand learning. From shame to complexity. From defeat to foreshadowing. This isn't set delusion, it's sept's authorship. I stem lost becomes this is the middle not the end. He left me becomes that chapter closed. It's realizing that truth isn't just about what happened. Because we all live in first drafts. It steps about how you tell what happened. But you get to choose which version makes it to print. And the narrator is constantly editing. Even memory isn't set safe. We re-narrate them. Science shows we don't remember events like files in a cabinet. We reconstruct them. Each recall is a retelling, and each retelling alters the past just a little bit more. So what sips true? It sips a moving target. But instead of fearing that, what if you leaned into it? A collage of perception, emotion, and voice. You're not lying when you tell yourself a kinder story. You're not delusional for shifting your inner narrative. You stir just taking the pen back. You stir not faking it when you reframe a moment. You're deciding that the narrator doesn't get to be cruel by default. You're becoming both the character and the chronicler. And that's powerful. You're choosing to tell the same events with a new lens. And more about alignment. Because, in the end, truth in narration is less about accuracy. Does the story you start telling align with growth? With healing? If it does, then maybe that's all the truth you need right now. With becoming someone who can keep turning the page. Because the facts might stay the same. But the narration, that sip's always in your hands. Think about it. But how many have survived your own revisions? You've lived 1,000 versions of yourself. Not because they didn't happen. There are parts of you no longer remember. But because they didn't fit the current story. Your mind, just like a writer with a red pen, is constantly revising, deleting, trimming. The you who once loved someone with all your heart. Rewording your past. And in that process, entire versions of you get erased. They're still there, somewhere, faded footnotes in the margins. The you who believed something you now find silly. The you who made a different choice, who dreamed in another direction, who wasn't yet afraid. You quietly revise the narrative, but they no longer appear in the main draft. Because every time you update your identity, memory isn't set to photograph. This is natural. It sups a constantly updated document. Every time you revisit it. It's called reconsolidation, The act of remembering literally changes the memory. You overwrite it. You replayed it so many times. The version you now remember is a story shaped by the narrator you've become. That argument you had years ago, not the one you were. That moment of shame, it might have been softened, or it might have been sharpened, depending on what you needed the story to say about who you are today. And like all revision processes, some parts get cut. You are, in a sense, constantly ghostwriting your own history. Maybe they were too hopeful. Some versions of you just don't survive the edit. Maybe they were too painful. So you revised them out. A quiet delete keystroke in the subconscious. Maybe they conflicted with the current narrative arc. But here sits the strange twist. They still leave fingerprints. Even as these past selves get erased from your story. In the songs you can't listen to anymore without crying. In the way you flinch when someone raises their voice. In the way you hesitate before trusting. In the dreams you never let yourself dream again. It only hides origin. Revision doesn't eliminate impact. And sometimes, when the story you start telling now begins to crack, but the scar still burns, you forget the chapter. When life gets too unpredictable, those old erased drafts try to return. When your identity starts to wobble, a forgotten laugh. A version of you whispering from the margins. A sudden memory. Remember me, I was real too. To revise again. And it's tempting to shut that voice out. To tighten the narrative. Is admit that your story has layers. But maybe the most honest thing you can do. Maybe wholeness isn't set to clean story. Some of which you've buried for convenience or survival. Maybe it's a messy manuscript full of crossed out lines, scribbled notes and voices that disagree. Because what if revision isn't set about perfection? Maybe those forgotten versions of you deserve a footnote at least. What if it's just another form of control? But to be safer? Not to be clearer. What if you stir editing yourself? To keep the contradictions hidden. To make the story digestible for others. To avoid the discomfort of saying, you don't have to live in them. I was someone else before this. But there's power in letting the erased lines resurface. You can remember that you were once softer, braver, more naive, more lost, more radiant, more foolish. And that all of it, but you can acknowledge them, was you. You are not just the final version. You stirred the entire editing process. The first draft, the rough cuts, the abandoned outlines, still echo in your narrative voice. And every piece, even the ones you thought you erased, open the drawer where you keep the discarded drafts. They still shape the way you write your next line. So here sits a gentle invitation. Not to judge, read them, but to witness. They mattered. They made you. Because even if those chapters never made it to the final version, your bones remember. And even if your narrator forgot the details, your breath remembers. The revision may be silent, used to have been editing your whole life, but the story is still alive beneath the surface. Now maybe, just maybe, it sets time to restore a few deleted lines. Every story ends. You narrated your entire life. Or at least, it quiets. Scene by scene, trying to make sense of a world that never came with a script. Line by line. And yet, what if the final truth isn't set another word? Because the closer you look, the more the story fades. But silence? Not because it wasn't set there, but because it never really was, at least not the way you thought. Every identity you've claimed was just a character role. Every belief, a literary device. Every opinion was a plot point. And now, as the last chapter draws near, the narrator falls quiet. Not out of fear, but because there's nothing left to explain. Not out of loss. You weren't set, even the reader. You were never the protagonist. You were never the author. A breath passed between mouths. You were the story being told. A sentence that kept rewriting itself. But as a pause so full of presence, it needs no punctuation. Not as a death. And now that sentence reaches a full stop. In the silence you begin to see all the ways language trapped you. How every time you said I am, you collapsed something infinite into something nameable. How every story arc made you forget the space between the words. The part where you really existed. How every label became a boundary. But in awareness. Not in identity. Not in memory. In being. Maybe that sips what silence really is. Not the absence of sound, but the return to truth before it was narrated. The moment before the first sentence was spoken. The breath before the character was born. To explain your thoughts, you might have spent your whole life trying to tell a coherent story, to prove your worth, to find your meaning. Maybe it was what you lost the moment you started writing. But maybe meaning was never something to be written. Because what if the story didn't need an ending? What if the purpose of all this wasn't to resolve the plot? What if you're not supposed to know what happens next? It reveals that there was never a narrator. That sips what silence does. But to learn how to live without needing one. Just narration. No center. Just unfolding. Just the space where story used to be. And in that space, you stop performing. No self. You stop trying to make your life rhyme. Instead, you listen. You stop editing. And in that listening you realize everything you were trying to become, you already were, before the story began. You were the silence. You were the space between the pages. You were the stillness that allowed the words to echo. No applause. And now, you return. No climax. The story ends. Just a final breath. Not with a twist, but with a whisper. You were never being told. Not with a lesson. You were always telling yourself. There is only this. And now that even that has quieted, and free. Still, unwritten, but the quiet unraveling of something far deeper. So now, we sit at the end. Not just the end of a script. The idea that you were ever a fixed self to begin with. You said walked through 30 layers of narrative illusion, each one peeling away the comfortable fiction. But what if you were never a character at all? That you are a solid, stable person, with a clear beginning, middle and end. What if you were always just a voice trying to describe the ocean, while drowning in it? They were never fixed truths. They were lines in a draft. All your thoughts, your memories, your fears. A sentence so often repeated, it began to feel like a soul, rewritten every time you looked again. You were a memory pretending to be a fact. But here sips what we sips learned. Every identity is a role, every emotion, a performance. And when you strip it all away, when you stop chasing the story, every belief, a chapter written by a ghost you can't name. Not answers. And just listen to the silence beneath the words. A vast, unmapped stillness. Just space. Not meaning, where no story needs to be told, because everything already is. Maybe you thought you were the protagonist, but now you know. Maybe you even thought you were the author. Maybe you thought you were the narrator. You were the shadow behind the metaphor. You were the pause between paragraphs. You were the page itself, blank, silent, and limitless. And as terrifying as that might sound, it's also the greatest freedom you still ever find. Because if you were written into existence, if you were scripted, you can also stop writing. There sips no longer a need to explain yourself. You can now step off the stage, prove yourself. There is no final chapter. Defend your past, or justify your future. No last-minute reveal that ties it all together. No hidden truth at the end of the story. There is only this moment, uncaptioned, unwritten, undefined. Not in the story, and that sips where you are, but in the noticing of it. Not in the plot, not in the meaning, but in the breath that holds it. Close the book, so go ahead. But in the stillness where the plot collapses, let your identity dissolve like old ink in rain. Let the narrative fall apart, and feel, maybe for the first time, what it means to exist. No character, without being told. No name, just this. No need, just now, just being. And in that silence, in that wordless presence, you are finally free.